Morning sunlight cut through the gaps in the blinds, laying golden stripes across the worn couch cushions. Damien Thorne's eyes opened slowly, his neck protesting the angle he'd slept at, his body registering the familiar discomfort of another night on furniture, meant for sitting, not sleeping. The apartment smelled different. Coffee. Fresh coffee, not the instant crystals he dissolved in lukewarm tap water to save on electricity. His heart kicked once hard before his brain caught up. Someone was in his kitchen. He turned his head, the world narrowed to a single image that made no sense. A woman stood at his counter, back to him, hair falling in dark waves past her shoulders, wearing a white button-down shirt that hung to mid-thigh. His shirt, the work shirt with the faded Cross Enterprises logo on the back, the one he draped over the chair last night because the fabric still smelled clean enough for one more wear. She moved with the ease of someone comfortable in strange kitchens, pouring coffee into the only mug he owned that didn't have a crack running through the ceramic. She turned, and the mug paused halfway to her lips. A small smile curved one corner of her mouth, the kind that suggested she knew something he didn't. Her eyes found his across the 12 feet separating them, and in that gaze sat an assessment, a calculation running behind irises the color of winter slate. The question arrived soft, almost amused. "You really don't remember last night, do you?" Damien's throat closed. Fragments surfaced, rain hammering metal, smoke thick enough to choke on, hands gripping a steering wheel, then a seatbelt, then warm skin slick with blood. He remembered carrying weight that shouldn't have been as light as it was, remembered the mechanical routine of checking for broken bones, for shock, for the thousand ways a body could fail after trauma. But the why remained a blank space, a hole where context should sit. His eyes tracked past her to the kitchen table. His laptop sat open, screen dark, but angled toward where he now lay. If she'd touched it, if she'd woken it from sleep, she would have seen the file still open from 3 nights ago when insomnia had driven him to old ghosts. The label would have been clear: Cross Enterprises. Compliance issues archived 2019. 6 years of work condensed into 47 pages he'd saved before they fired him, before the severance package that came with an NDA thick enough to bury careers. The woman set the mug down with care, the ceramic meeting laminate with barely a sound. When she spoke again, each word carried weight, the kind that came from boardrooms and depositions, in moments where precision mattered more than warmth. She said, "I'm Elena Cross, the woman whose car you saved last night." A pause stretched between them, and in that silence, Damien felt the shape of the trap, even if he couldn't see its edges yet. Her next words landed like stones in still water, "And the woman whose company owns the building you live in." The couch creaked as Damien sat up, his maintenance supervisor instincts already cataloging problems. She knew where he worked. She'd seen inside his apartment, seen the stack of bills held down by a coffee mug on the counter, seen the twin mattress in the corner where his daughter slept behind a curtain made from a bedsheet tacked to the ceiling. She'd seen poverty made specific, given an address, given his face. And she was the CEO of Cross Enterprises, the woman whose father had built an empire on government contracts and venture capital, the woman whose signature appeared on the paychecks that kept Damien's bank account hovering just above zero. Damien's voice came out rougher than intended. "How long have you been awake?" "Since 5. Your coffee maker is temperamental." She gestured to the ancient machine he'd rescued from the building's trash room 2 years back, the one that sputtered and hissed, but still produced something close to drinkable. "I hope you don't mind. I needed something to ground me after." The bedroom curtain rustled. Small feet padded across linoleum, and then Amara emerged, her hair a nimbus of coils that refused to be tamed by sleep, her gap-toothed smile already forming before her eyes fully opened. She wore the pajamas with the glow-in-the-dark stars, the ones Damien had bought on clearance last September when she'd announced she wanted to be an astronomer. She stopped when she saw Elena, her smile freezing into something more cautious. The question tumbled out high and clear. "Daddy, who's the pancake lady?" Damien's mind fumbled for the right words, the ones that would explain without explaining, that would give his daughter enough truth to satisfy her, while keeping the complicated adult realities at bay. But Elena spoke first, dropping to one knee, so her eyes met Amara's, the movement unconscious, the kind that spoke of someone who understood how to meet children on their level. Her voice gentled. "Just someone your daddy helped last night. You must be Amara." "How do you know my name?" Suspicion threaded through Amara's tone, the wariness of a 7-year-old who'd learned early that strangers knowing things they shouldn't was a warning sign. Elena's gaze flicked to the refrigerator, to the drawings held up by magnets shaped like cartoon animals. One showed a crayon family of 2, labeled in careful block letters, Daddy and Amara. Another displayed the solar system, each planet colored with the kind of attention to detail that required reference materials and dedication. At the bottom, in Amara's handwriting, "My daddy, the secret hero." The words hung in the air, visible to anyone who looked, and Damien felt the cold spread through his chest. Secret hero. The phrase Amara had coined last month when she'd found him, hunched over his laptop late at night, when she'd asked what he was working on, and he'd told her he was trying to help people who couldn't help themselves. She'd absorbed that, turned it into a title, drawn it onto paper with the certainty of someone who believed her father could fix anything. Elena's expression shifted, something moving behind her eyes that looked almost like recognition, like she was seeing a reflection of something she'd lost or never had. She rose smoothly, the borrowed shirt falling back into place, and turned to Damien with a different kind of calculation in her gaze now. "I should go. My driver has been waiting since 6. She moved toward the bedroom, and Damien's brain finally lurched into gear. "Your clothes are in the dryer. They should be ready." She paused. "You did my laundry. You were unconscious, soaked, and potentially hypothermic." "Yes, I did your laundry." The words came out flat, professional, the tone he used when filing maintenance reports and documenting building violations. Elena's mouth quirked. Most men wouldn't have bothered. Most men aren't responsible for a 7-year-old who asks questions about unconscious women in wet clothes. That landed, and for half a second, something like respect flickered across Elena's features. She disappeared into the bedroom, and Damien heard the dryer door open, heard the rustle of expensive fabric being retrieved from a machine that cost less than her shoes probably had. Amara climbed onto the couch next to him, her small weight a familiar comfort. Her whisper barely reached his ears. "Is she nice?" "I don't know yet, baby." "She looks sad." Damien glanced at his daughter, at the way her eyes tracked toward the bedroom, with the kind of intuition that always startled him. Amara had been 3 when Celeste died, too young to remember her mother's face without photographs, but old enough to have developed some kind of radar for grief. She spotted it in others the way some people notice colors or heard music in ambient noise. Elena emerged dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Damien's monthly salary, her hair pulled back, her armor restored. She looked every inch the CEO now, all traces of vulnerability erased or buried. She stopped at the door, one hand on the knob, and turned back. From her purse, she withdrew a wallet, leather so soft it seemed to breathe. She pulled out bills, counted them with the efficiency of someone who'd handled money so long it had lost meaning, and set a stack on the kitchen table. Damien didn't need to count to know it was more than he made in a month. Probably more than 3 months. Elena's voice carried the crisp certainty of someone used to solving problems with resources. "For last night, the bed, the clothes, the coffee, everything." The words hit Damien like a physical blow. For a moment, he couldn't breathe around the sudden compression in his chest, around the understanding that she'd looked at his apartment, at his daughter, at his life, and reduced it all to a transaction. That she thought the help he'd given, the basic human decency of pulling someone from a burning car, could be purchased, could be settled, like a debt between strangers. He stood, and the movement brought him to his full height, brought the 36 years of living in a body that moved through the world as a problem to be solved or a threat to be managed. He crossed the room in 4 steps, picked up the money, and held it out to her. The rejection came quiet, each word carved from something harder than stone. "I didn't do it for money." Elena's hand remained at her side. "I'm not suggesting you did. I'm being practical." Practical. The word tasted bitter. Damien's grip on the bills tightened, and he took one step closer, close enough to see the way her pupils dilated slightly, close enough to watch her process the fact that he wasn't backing down. "You think throwing cash around makes you practical. You think you can buy your way out of owing someone basic human kindness." "That's not what I meant." But her voice had lost its certainty, developed a hairline crack. Damien extended his arm further, the money nearly touching her chest. "Take it back. I don't need your guilt money, and I sure as hell don't need you turning what I did into some kind of business transaction." The air between them crystallized, became something sharp and fragile. Amara's breathing went quiet behind them, and Damien could feel his daughter's attention like a weight on his shoulders, could imagine what she was learning from this moment about how her father stood in the world. Elena's fingers closed around the bills, and for a heartbeat their hands occupied the same space, her manicured nails against his calloused knuckles. Then she pulled back the money, disappearing into her purse with a swift, almost violent motion. "Most people would have taken it." The words came soft, almost wondering. "Then I guess you need to meet better people." Damien stepped back, putting distance between them before the proximity could do something neither of them intended. Something shifted in Elena's expression, a wall coming down, or a calculation being revised. She looked at him with fresh eyes, and in that gaze, Damien recognized the assessment of someone who just had their assumptions challenged, who was being forced to recategorize the world in real time. She glanced at Amara still perched on the couch, watching them with the wide-eyed attention of someone witnessing adults behave in ways that didn't match the scripts she'd been taught. Elena's voice dropped, became something closer to genuine. "I apologize. That was thoughtless." Damien's jaw tightened. "Yeah, it was." The silence that followed carried too much weight pressed against the walls of the small apartment until Damien thought something might crack. Elena moved to the door again, and this time she opened it, letting in the cold January morning and the sounds of the building waking up around them. At the threshold, she paused. "What's your name?" "Your real name, not just the one on the maintenance roster." Damien Thorne." She repeated it slowly, testing the shape in her mouth. "Damien Thorne." Then she was gone, and the door closed with a soft click that felt louder than it should have. Amara's voice broke the quiet. "Daddy, why did you get mad?" Damien sank back onto the couch, suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the night's interrupted sleep. Because sometimes people forget that money can't fix everything. That some things you just do because they're right. Like saving her. "Yeah, baby. Like that." Amara climbed into his lap, her small arms wrapping around his neck. Her breath was warm against his shoulder when she whispered, "Our light shines small, but it shines bright." The phrase he taught her, the one he repeated on the nights when the electricity bill came due and the bank account showed 2 digits instead of 3, when he lay awake doing math that never quite added up. It was the thing he told her when she asked why they couldn't afford new shoes, or why dinner was rice and beans again, or why Daddy looked so tired. He held her tighter. "That's right, Amara. Small, but bright." The morning crept forward. Damien made actual breakfast using the eggs and bread he'd been saving for the weekend, because Amara needed something in her stomach and because the routine of cooking gave his hands something to do while his mind processed the last 12 hours. He walked her to the bus stop, watched her climb aboard with her backpack and lunch made from leftovers, watched the yellow vehicle pull away, carrying his entire world toward another day of school where she'd be the kid whose clothes came from thrift stores and whose lunches never included the packaged snacks other children traded. Back in the apartment, Damien stood in front of his laptop. The file still sat there, closed now, but present, a ghost of the career he'd left behind. Cross Enterprises, Compliance Issues Archive 2019. He'd been an investigator, then had worked for a mid-tier consulting firm that did corporate compliance audits. Cross Enterprises had hired them to review their labor practices after a minor lawsuit, and Damien had been assigned to comb through payroll records, interview workers, verify that the company was following both the letter and spirit of employment law. He'd found discrepancies. Small ones at first, easily explained as clerical errors or system glitches, but the pattern had emerged over weeks of digging: maintenance workers paid at rates below their union contracts, overtime hours that disappeared between time cards and paychecks, workers who complained and then found themselves reassigned to less desirable shifts or buildings. Nothing egregious enough to be obvious, but enough to form a picture of systematic wage suppression affecting predominantly Black and Latino workers, people who looked like him, who struggled like he struggled, who couldn't afford lawyers or the risk of losing employment by pushing back too hard. Damien had written it up, presented his findings to his supervisor, recommended a full investigation with subpoena power and forensic accounting. 2 days later, he'd been called into an office and told his services were no longer required. The severance package had been generous, the NDA airtight. He'd taken the money because Celeste had been in treatment and medical bills didn't care about principles. He'd signed the papers that said he'd never speak about what he'd found, that he'd delete all files and return all materials, that he'd walk away and pretend those 6 months of work had never happened. Except he'd saved one copy, backed it up to a drive he'd hidden in a box of Celeste's things in a place no one would think to look, because who searched a dead woman's keepsakes for corporate espionage? He'd told himself it was insurance that if Cross Enterprises ever came after him, he'd have proof of what he'd found. But really it was guilt. The guilt of walking away, of taking the money, of letting the injustice continue, because he had a dying wife and a daughter who needed a father more than she needed a martyr. The laptop screen reflected his face back at him, and in that dark mirror, Damien saw a man who'd spent 5 years doing maintenance work at the very company he'd once investigated, a man who fixed broken pipes and changed light bulbs and pretended he didn't know what the corporate offices 3 floors up were hiding. And now the CEO had slept in his bed, had drunk his coffee, had offered him money like he was just another problem to be solved with the contents of her wallet. The absurdity of it would have been funny if it didn't make him want to put his fist through the wall. His phone buzzed. A text from Daniel Foster, the neighbor who watched Amara when Damien worked late shifts. "Everything okay this morning? Saw a fancy car outside." Damien typed back. "Long story. Thanks for keeping Amara last night." The response came quick. "Anytime, son. That girl's a treasure." Damien pocketed the phone and moved through the apartment, straightening cushions and washing the single coffee mug Elena had used, erasing the physical traces of her presence, even as his mind kept circling back to the way she'd looked at his refrigerator drawings, to the crack in her voice when she'd apologized, to the calculation in her eyes when he'd refused her money. The television in the corner was a relic from better days, a flat screen Celeste had insisted they buy before she got sick, when they'd still believed in futures that included saving for down payments and retirement accounts. Damien turned it on more from habit than intention, let the morning news fill the silence while he folded the blanket he'd used on the couch. The anchor's voice cut through his thoughts. In developing news, CEO Elena Cross of Cross Enterprises survived a dramatic car crash late last night. Sources say a local resident pulled her from the burning vehicle just moments before it exploded. Miss Cross was treated for minor injuries and released early this morning. Damien's hands stilled on the blanket. The screen showed footage of the crash site emergency lights painting the rain-soaked street in red and blue. The Mercedes was a twisted sculpture, metal bent and blackened, unrecognizable as anything that had once carried human life. Damien's stomach turned over as he registered how close it had been, how narrow the margin between rescue and tragedy. 5 seconds later, maybe 10, and Elena Cross would have died in that car while he drove past thinking someone else would handle it. The coverage switched to Elena standing in front of Cross Enterprises headquarters, microphones clustered like metal flowers in front of her face. She wore the same suit she'd left his apartment in, her composure perfect, not a hair out of place. But Damien had seen her without that armor, had seen her vulnerable and afraid and human, and he couldn't unsee it now. A reporter's question, "Can you tell us who saved you?" Elena's pause stretched half a second longer than it should have. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that suggested she was choosing words with care, that what she said mattered more than usual. "A man who showed me something I'd forgotten. That integrity isn't about what you can afford to buy. It's about who you are when no one's keeping score." Another reporter pushing forward, "Will you be releasing his name? Will you be rewarding him for his heroism?" "No, he values his privacy and I value my debts." Elena's eyes found the camera, and Damien felt the weight of that gaze, even through the television screen, felt like she was looking directly at him across the miles and through the lens. "But if he's watching, I want him to know I won't forget what he did, and I won't forget what he taught me." The segment ended, cutting to commercial, and Damien stood frozen in his apartment, the remote still in his hand, his mind racing through implications. She'd talked about him on television, had used language that would make anyone who heard it curious, that would send people looking for the mysterious savior who'd refused recognition and refused payment. Had essentially announced to the world that someone had gotten under her skin, had made her feel something she hadn't expected. Amara's voice echoed in his memory. "Daddy, that's the pancake lady." He'd explained it away in the moment, had distracted his daughter with breakfast and the routine of getting ready for school. But Amara was 7, not stupid. She'd connect the dots, eventually would put together the woman in their kitchen with the woman on television, would ask the questions Damien didn't have good answers for yet. His phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, local area code. Against his better judgment, Damien answered. The voice on the other end belonged to someone he hadn't spoken to in 6 years, someone he'd worked with before Cross Enterprises had ended his investigative career. "Damien, it's Beverly Wright. I don't know if you remember me, but we worked together on—" "I remember." How could he forget? Beverly had been the HR assistant who'd slipped him documents she wasn't supposed to have access to, who'd confirmed his suspicions about the payroll irregularities, who'd pointed him toward the workers who would talk if promised confidentiality. She'd been fired 3 weeks after Damien left, terminated for misuse of company resources, which everyone knew meant she'd helped him dig too deep. "What do you want, Beverly?" "I saw the news. About Elena Cross. About someone saving her." Beverly's voice dropped lower, became urgent in a way that made Damien's spine straighten. "Damien, I need to know. Was it you?" The question hung between them, and Damien understood immediately what she was really asking. If it was him, if he'd gotten close to Elena Cross, if the CEO now felt she owed him something, then maybe there was an opportunity. Maybe the investigation he'd abandoned could be resurrected, could be finished the way it should have been finished the first time. He kept his voice neutral, non-committal. Why does it matter? Because it's gotten worse. So much worse than what you found in 2019. Papers rustled on Beverly's end, and Damien could picture her in some cramped apartment, surrounded by documentation she'd been collecting for years, building a case no one wanted to hear. I've been documenting for years now, keeping records. At least 70 workers, maybe more, I'm still finding them. Most of them Black, some Latino, all underpaid systematically. I have time cards that don't match paychecks. I have testimony from people too scared to go public. I have patterns that can't be explained as accidents. The number hit him like a physical blow. 70 workers. He'd found maybe a dozen cases in his original investigation, had projected that the problem was bigger, but hadn't had the evidence to prove it. But 70, that wasn't negligence. That wasn't a few bad managers making isolated decisions. That was policy, systematic and deliberate. Beverly continued, her voice tight with frustration and hope in equal measure. I tried going to the Department of Labor. They said they needed more concrete proof before they could open a formal investigation. They get complaints about big companies all the time, and most of them go nowhere. I tried lawyers, but no one wants to take on cross enterprises without a guaranteed win and a clear paper trail that connects to executive responsibility. I even got a meeting with someone at the local news, spent 2 hours laying out the evidence, and they killed the story before it aired. Said they couldn't verify the claims without more sources willing to go on record, and everyone's too afraid of retaliation. Why are you telling me this? Damien asked, even though he already knew the answer, could feel the weight of what Beverly was about to ask settling on his shoulders like a familiar burden. Because you were the only person who ever tried to do something about it. Because you found it first and they shut you down, and I know you've been living with that for 6 years. Beverly's voice cracked slightly, revealing emotion underneath the professional veneer. And because if Elena Cross is grateful to you, if she owes you something, if you can get close enough to her to access what we need, Damien, I don't have everything yet. I'm still missing the financial trail, the documentation that connects this to actual executive policy. But if we work together, if you can get inside while I work from the outside, we might actually be able to finish this. I have a daughter, Beverly. I can't risk. Those 70 workers have children too. The words came sharp, cutting. Some of them lost their homes because they couldn't make rent on what Cross Enterprises was paying them. Some of them are working 2 jobs now, 3 jobs, destroying their health and never seeing their kids to make up for wages they should have been paid in the first place. Their children are growing up watching parents work themselves to death for poverty wages while the company posts record profits. Beverly paused, let that sink in, then delivered the final blow. I'm not asking you to be a hero. I'm not asking you to sacrifice your daughter's stability. I'm asking you to help me finish what you started. To gather the proof we need so that this time when we go public, they can't bury it. So that this time those workers get justice instead of watching another investigator walk away because it's too hard or too risky. The line went dead and Damien stood in his kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of his small life, his safe life, the life he'd built from the ashes of his investigative career and his wife's death. The bills on the counter told their own story. $875 rent, due in 5 days, $215 electric bill, and already 2 weeks overdue, 4 leads in his checking account, and payday still a week away. He was one emergency from eviction, one sick day from falling behind on everything, one unexpected expense, from the kind of financial catastrophe that would swallow families like his whole. He could ignore Beverly's call, could delete the number, could forget she'd ever reached out, could continue fixing pipes and changing light bulbs and pretending he didn't see the machinery of injustice grinding away 3 floors above his head. Could keep his daughter safe in the small stability he'd managed to build, could avoid the risks that came with poking at systems designed to crush people who challenged them. Or he could open the laptop, could look at that file from 2019, could see if the patterns he'd identified then matched what Beverly was describing now. Could start asking questions again, could start documenting again, could start being the person Amara drew on refrigerator art with the label Secret Hero. The person he'd been before fear and grief and responsibility had taught him that survival sometimes mattered more than principles. The choice sat in front of him, as clear and binary as a switch. Damien opened the laptop. The file loaded slowly, pages of data and analysis he'd compiled with the meticulous care of someone who believed documentation mattered, who thought evidence could change things if presented properly. He read through his own notes from 6 years ago, saw the younger version of himself trying to build a case strong enough to overcome corporate legal teams and NDAs and the quiet machinery of reputation management that protected companies like Cross Enterprises from scrutiny. He'd failed then, but then he'd been alone, had been an outside contractor with no authority and no leverage and no protection when they decided to shut him down. Things were different now. He worked inside Cross Enterprises, had access to buildings and workers, and the small vulnerabilities that existed in every system if you knew where to look. He knew which managers left computers unlocked, which offices had lax security, which workers might talk if someone they trusted asked the right questions. And Elena Cross owed him something. Might not know yet exactly what that debt would cost, but the debt existed. She'd said as much on television, had basically announced to the world that she valued what he'd done, that she wouldn't forget it. He could use this, could get close enough to find the evidence Beverly needed, could document the wage theft from the inside with Elena's implicit endorsement protecting him from the retaliation that had ended his investigation 6 years ago. It would mean lying, would mean using her gratitude as cover her trust as a weapon against her own company, would mean building a relationship under false pretenses, pretending his interest was personal, when really it was evidence gathering dressed up as friendship or whatever else might develop between them. The ethical weight of it pressed against Damien's chest made breathing difficult. But he thought about Beverly's 70 workers, about families losing homes while Cross Enterprises posted record profits, about the pattern of exploitation that had survived 6 years because no one with power had cared enough to stop it, because people like him had chosen safety over justice when the choice got hard. He picked up his phone and dialed Beverly's number. She answered on the first ring, her voice tight with hope and fear in equal measure. "Damien, tell me everything. Every worker you've documented, every discrepancy you've found, every piece of evidence you have. And then tell me exactly what you need me to find." Outside, the January morning continued its slow crawl toward noon, indifferent to the choices being made in a small apartment in a building owned by the woman whose empire Damien was about to start examining for cracks. The television still played in the background, cycling through news and weather and advertisements for products no one in this neighborhood could afford. But Damien wasn't watching anymore. He was listening to Beverly's voice detail. Years of systematic theft, was making notes on the back of an envelope, was beginning to see the shape of something larger than he'd imagined, something that required more than just one man's conscience to fix. Small, but bright, he'd told Amara. Maybe it was time to test whether that was enough. The afternoon stretched ahead, full of possibilities and dangers in equal measure. Damien would eventually have to reach out to Elena, would have to accept whatever olive branch she extended, would begin the careful dance of getting close while maintaining enough distance to do what needed doing. But first he needed a plan. Needed to understand exactly what Beverly had, what evidence gaps remained, and how he could gather the missing pieces without exposing himself, or more importantly, without putting Amara at risk of losing the only parent she had left. Because at the end of everything, the investigation, the evidence, the potential confrontation with one of the state's most powerful companies, he still had to wake up every morning and be a father to a 7-year-old who believed her daddy was a secret hero. And heroes Damien was learning didn't always get to choose between doing what was right and protecting the people they loved. Sometimes they had to find a way to do both, even when the path forward looked impossible, even when success meant becoming someone he wasn't sure he wanted to be. His phone buzzed with a new message. "Unknown number, Mr. Thorne. This is Marcus, Miss Cross's head of security. She asked me to deliver something to you. I'll be at your building in 20 minutes. The message arrived without context, without explanation, and Damien felt Elena Cross inserting herself back into his life, whether he was ready or not. 20 minutes later, a knock sounded at his door. Damien opened it to find a man in a black suit, professional and patient, holding a cream-colored envelope with the weight of expensive stationery. "Mr. Thorne, from Miss Cross." Damien took the envelope, and Marcus was already turning away and already moving toward the stairs with the efficiency of someone on a tight schedule. The door clicked, and Damien was alone with whatever Elena had sent, with the certain knowledge that opening it would change things in ways he couldn't fully predict. He opened it carefully. Inside, a handwritten note on heavy paper that probably cost more per sheet than his weekly grocery budget. "Mr. Thorne, I regret my thoughtlessness this morning. You were right to refuse what I offered. Some things cannot and should not be reduced to transactions, and I apologize for trying to make our interaction into one. I would like the chance to apologize properly and to discuss how I might support the work you clearly care about on your terms, not mine. If you're willing to talk, my direct line is attached. With respect, Elena Cross." The business card was simple, embossed with a number that bypassed assistants and went straight to her private office. Damien held it between his fingers, feeling the quality of the cardstock, and understood that Elena Cross had just handed him exactly what he needed: access, credibility, and the CEO's personal attention. He could use this, could get close enough to find the evidence Beverly needed, could document the wage theft from the inside with Elena's implicit endorsement protecting him from retaliation. Could finish what he'd started 6 years ago, could get justice for workers who deserved it. All he had to do was lie. Use her gratitude, exploit her trust, pretend his interest was genuine when really it was strategy. The weight of that choice pressed against him as he stood in his small apartment, holding a business card that represented both opportunity and moral compromise. Small but bright, Amara had said. The light his daughter believed in, the heroism she'd drawn onto paper and stuck to the refrigerator. Damien looked at that drawing now, at the crayon version of himself with the label Secret Hero, and wondered if Amara would still see him that way when this was over, when the truth came out about what he'd done and who he'd hurt to get justice for people he'd never met. But the 70 workers Beverly had documented, they had children too. Children who deserved fathers who didn't work themselves to death for poverty wages. Children who deserved to see that systems could change, that injustice could be challenged, that sometimes the light shone bright enough to matter. Damien picked up his phone and dialed Beverly one more time. "I'm in," he said when she answered. "Tell me what you need me to find, and I'll find it." Then he set Elena's business card on his kitchen counter, right next to the bills he couldn't pay and the laptop holding evidence from 6 years ago, and began planning how to become the kind of person who could smile at someone while secretly working to dismantle everything they'd built. The kind of person who could choose justice over honesty, principle over relationship, the greater good over personal integrity. The kind of person he'd sworn he'd never be again. But the light had to shine somewhere, and sometimes Damien was beginning to understand it had to shine in the darkest places of all, including the compromises people made when every choice looked like betrayal, and the only question was who you'd betray and whether you could live with yourself afterward. 3 days passed in careful avoidance. Damien worked his shifts, documented what Beverly had asked him to watch for, and ignored the business card that sat on his kitchen counter like an accusation. Elena Cross's direct line, a phone number that represented opportunity and compromise in equal measure. He'd met with Beverly at the library as planned. She'd arrived with 2 banker's boxes full of documentation, photocopied time cards, pay stubs with discrepancies, highlighted handwritten testimony from workers too afraid to use their real names. They'd spread it across a study table on the 4th floor, and Damien had spent 3 hours absorbing the evidence of systematic theft that had grown worse, not better, in the 6 years since he'd walked away. Beverly had changed. The nervous HR assistant, he remembered, had hardened into someone who understood how institutions protected themselves, who'd learned that documentation was the only defense against willful blindness. She showed him the patterns workers consistently paid $4 to $5 below their contracted rates overtime, that vanished between approval and paychecks, complaints that disappeared into HR files never to be investigated. "I need the financial trail," Beverly had said, pushing a legal pad toward him covered in questions. "Where does the money go after it's skimmed from payroll? Who authorizes the discrepancies? Is there a shell company, offshore accounts, someone at the executive level signing off?" Damien had studied her notes, recognizing the methodology of someone who'd been preparing for this moment for years. "You've been building this case alone." "Someone had to. After they fired me, I got a job at a competitor. But I stayed in touch with people still working at Cross, collected evidence whenever they'd share it." Her fingers had drummed against the table. "But I'm missing the smoking gun. The document that proves intent, that shows this isn't just accounting errors but actual policy." That conversation had happened 48 hours ago, and since then Damien had been cataloging the access he'd need: executive floor trash, unlocked computers during after-hours maintenance, server rooms where backup files lived. All of it theoretically available to a maintenance supervisor who knew where to look and when to be invisible. But getting that access safely required cover, required a reason to be places he shouldn't be asking questions that would raise flags if anyone noticed the pattern. Which brought him back to the business card, to Elena Cross and her offer to talk on his terms. Damien picked up his phone before he could second-guess the decision, dialed the number. 2 rings, then her voice slightly breathless, like she'd rushed to answer. Damien, no preamble, no corporate greeting, just his name spoken with something that sounded like relief. "You said we could talk, on my terms." "Yes, whenever you're ready, wherever you want." He'd expected negotiation, expected her to suggest her office or some neutral restaurant. The immediate capitulation caught him off guard, reminded him that beneath the CEO exterior was someone who'd spent the morning in his kitchen looking uncertain and human. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. your office. Better to establish the relationship there where security cameras would document their meetings, where their interaction would seem professional rather than personal. And Elena, this conversation is about establishing boundaries, about making sure we understand each other before anything else happens. A pause, then, I'll make sure we're not interrupted. The line went dead and Damien was left holding a phone that felt heavier than it should, weighted with the knowledge of what he was about to start. Elena's office occupied the top floor of Cross Enterprises, a space designed to intimidate with floor-to-ceiling windows and furniture that cost more than most people's cars. Damien arrived exactly at 10, refused the coffee her assistant offered, and sat across from her desk with the posture of someone prepared for negotiation rather than supplication. She had notes, actual bullet points on a legal pad, the kind of preparation that suggested she'd taken his requirement for boundaries seriously. The formality of it eased something in Damien's chest, made this feel less like a trap and more like two people trying to find stable ground. Elena's pen tapped against the pad, a nervous gesture that didn't match her controlled delivery. I've been thinking about how to do this right, how to acknowledge what you did without making you feel bought or managed. That's a good start. So here's what I'm proposing. She slid the legal pad across the desk. First, no more unilateral decisions about your life. If I want to help with something, anything, I ask first. You have full veto power. Damien scanned her notes, seeing the structure of someone used to contracts and negotiations. Second, your job security is completely separate from whatever personal relationship we may or may not develop. You're employed based on your work performance period. What happens between us outside work stays outside. And third, Elena's voice softened slightly. If I cross a line, you call me on it. Immediately. No letting resentment build because you're trying to be polite. The vulnerability in that last point surprised him. Damien leaned back, studying her across the expensive desk, seeing past the CEO armor to someone who genuinely didn't know how to have relationships that weren't transactional. My terms are simpler, he said. You stop trying to solve my problems without asking what I actually need. You accept that I'm going to say no sometimes, and no doesn't mean I'm ungrateful. I can do that. And if we're going to have any kind of relationship, professional, personal, whatever, it's between equals. Your money doesn't make you better than me, and my moral high ground doesn't make me better than you. Elena's expression shifted into something that looked like relief. Equals, yes, I want that. They shook hands across the desk, and the contact lasted longer than professional necessity required. Elena's fingers were warm, her grip firm, and when she smiled, the expression reached her eyes in a way Damien hadn't seen before. Have dinner with me, she said, tomorrow night, somewhere quiet where we can actually talk without performing. The invitation carried implications beyond the words, and Damien felt the trajectory of his plans shifting, felt the careful lines between using her and knowing her starting to blur before they had even been fully drawn. But he needed this, needed the access, the credibility, the protection her interest would provide while he gathered evidence. And if part of him wanted to say yes for reasons that had nothing to do with investigation, well, he'd deal with that complication later. I picked the place and we split the check. Elena's laugh came genuine and surprised. Deal. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged that pulled Damien in two directions simultaneously. Elena visited on Thursdays, the one day he worked the early shift and could be home by 6. She brought takeout from restaurants Amara had never heard of, taught his daughter astronomy, using apps that turned the ceiling into a planetarium, played chess with the patience of someone who understood that losing to a 7-year-old was its own kind of victory. Damien watched them together and felt something dangerous taking root. Hope that looked like family possibility, that tasted like future emotions that scared him more than any practical fear usually did. But Tuesdays and Saturdays belonged to Beverly. Over the first month, they established a careful protocol, different locations, each time encrypted messages, dead drops for documents too sensitive to carry openly. Damien would photograph papers from unsecured offices during late-night maintenance calls, download files from computers left logged in note patterns in executive schedules and security rotations. Every Tuesday at 2 p.m., he'd meet Beverly somewhere public, but anonymous coffee shops in different neighborhoods, library study rooms, once in her car, in a grocery store parking lot 20 miles outside the city. She'd review what he'd found, cross-reference it with her own documentation, and identify the next pieces they needed. You're getting good at this, Beverly said during their fourth meeting in mid-February, spreading his photographs across a coffee shop table. These payroll reports show the discrepancy clearly. Workers approved for 45 hours paychecks calculated at 40. That's just one department. How many others are affected? At least 6 that I can confirm. Probably more. Beverly's finger traced a pattern across the documents. But look at the authorization code, same sequence across all departments. Someone in the executive office is processing these manually, overriding the automated system. Damien studied the codes, recognizing the implications. That's not negligence. That's deliberate. Exactly. Which means we need to find who has access to these codes and why they're using them. Beverly looked up, her expression carrying the weight of someone who'd been fighting this battle alone for too long. I've got testimony from workers. I've got documentation of underpayment. What I don't have is proof that connects this to executive policy. Without that, Cross Enterprises just claims its isolated errors and fires a few low-level managers. The enormity of what they were attempting settled over Damien like a physical weight. They weren't just exposing wage theft. They were building a federal case against one of the state's largest employers, trying to prove systematic conspiracy in an organization designed to protect itself from exactly this kind of scrutiny. Victor Ashford, Damien said, Chief Financial Officer. If anyone designed this system, it's him. Then we need access to his files, which you don't have. Damien thought about Elena, about the dinners they'd been having weekly, about the way she'd started asking his opinion on foundation decisions and actually listening to his answers, about how trust was building between them, genuine and complicated and useful. I'm working on that. Beverly's eyes narrowed. Damien, I need you to be careful. I know she seems nice. I know you're developing feelings. But at the end of this, she's either going to be devastated by what we find, or she's complicit and will use everything she knows about you to destroy the investigation. She doesn't know, I'm sure of it. How can you be sure she's the CEO? How does systematic wage theft happen for 6 years without her knowledge? The question haunted Damien as he drove home that evening. How did Elena not know? Was she truly that insulated from operational details? Or was she playing a longer game, using his attraction to monitor what he was discovering? He didn't have answers. Only the growing certainty that whatever he found would eventually force him to choose between protecting Elena and protecting the workers whose stolen wages financed her empire. The weeks accumulated into months. January turned to February, then March. Winter gave way to early spring, and the pattern held: Thursdays with Elena and Amara, Tuesdays with Beverly, Saturdays gathering evidence from offices that should have been empty, but never quite were. Damien learned Elena in layers. The CEO who commanded boardrooms dissolved into someone who laughed at Amara's jokes and asked genuine questions about orbital mechanics because his daughter wanted to talk about Jupiter's moons. The woman who'd offered him cash that first morning transformed into someone who brought groceries without comment, who fixed Amara's bike chain because she'd grown up poor and knew how to work with her hands, who sat on his worn couch and seemed more comfortable there than in her penthouse office. And through it all, Damien documented, photographed payroll discrepancies, noted which executives had access to override codes, built spreadsheets that matched Beverly's methodology, cross-referencing dates and amounts and authorization sequences. The evidence grew. 70 workers became 76, then 82, as more people came forward through Beverly's network. The pattern sharpened into something undeniable: systematic wage suppression, targeting minority workers, executed with precision that suggested institutional knowledge. But the financial trail remained elusive. Where did the money go after it was skimmed? How did millions of dollars disappear from payroll without triggering audits? Who benefited beyond the obvious boost to quarterly profit margins? We're missing something, Beverly said in late April, frustration evident in the way she shuffled documents across their library table. The money has to go somewhere. Shell companies, offshore accounts, executive bonuses tied to cost reduction, something. But I can't find the connection. Victor Ashford's office, Damien said, not for the first time. If the trail exists, it's there, which you still can't access without raising red flags. Beverly leaned back, studied him. How's it going with her, with Elena? The question carried layers Damien didn't want to examine. It's complicated. Complicated how? She's not what I expected. She's genuine with Amara. She listens when I talk. She's trying to use her money for good. The foundation is actually helping people. So you're developing feelings? Beverly's voice carried no judgment, just observation. I'm doing what we agreed, getting close, building trust. That's not what I asked. Damien didn't answer because any answer would be a confession he wasn't ready to make. That some Thursday evenings he forgot why Elena was there, forgot about the investigation and the evidence, and the choice he'd eventually have to make. That watching her teach Amara about constellations made his chest ache was something that felt dangerously like hope. That he was starting to care about her in ways that had nothing to do with access or strategy. Beverly seemed to read the silence for what it was. Just remember what we're doing this for. Those 82 workers, their families, the justice they deserve. I haven't forgotten. Good, because we're getting close. I can feel it. One more piece, one document that proves executive knowledge, and we'll have everything we need. 6 weeks after the foundation launched preliminary programs, Elena invited Damien to the official gala. The invitation arrived on heavy cardstock with formal language, but tucked inside was a handwritten note that made his chest tighten. I hope you'll come. This wouldn't exist without you, and I'd like you to see what we're building together. The word together lingered in Damien's mind as he borrowed a suit from Daniel Foster and helped Amara into a dress that Daniel's wife had altered to fit. When they arrived at the convention center in early May, Damien's first thought was that Elena had outdone herself. The space transformed into something that balanced elegance with accessibility, that made clear this wasn't just another charity event for wealthy donors to feel good about themselves. His second thought, arriving with the force of a physical blow, was that the banner stretching across the entrance was wrong. The Thorn Foundation, his name, 3 feet tall, visible to everyone entering, everyone with a camera, every journalist looking for a story. The fury came immediate and consuming. Damien stood frozen while people streamed around him, while Amara tugged his hand asking what was wrong, while his brain processed that Elena had done it again, had made a decision about his life without asking, had turned his identity into a brand without permission or warning. She found them before he'd moved 10 steps inside. Wore white, simple, and elegant, and her smile carried confidence that suggested she knew exactly what she'd done and believed it was justified. Mr. Thorne, Amara, I'm so glad you could make it. Damien's voice came out flat with barely controlled anger. You used my name, without asking. Elena's expression didn't shift into defense or apology. Instead, she met his eyes with steady certainty. I used your name because it represents what this foundation stands for. Dignity, hard work, choosing to help because it's right, not because you expect something back. We agreed on boundaries. We did, and I'm breaking them because sometimes the right thing matters more than the comfortable thing. Her jaw set. You can be angry. You can leave. But look around first. See what your name is making possible. Damien wanted to walk out to make a scene that would match what she'd created. But Amara was watching, donors were gathering, and the program showed services that could genuinely help families. Services that wouldn't exist if he let wounded pride destroy them. A woman approached with a microphone. Mr. Thorne, we need you backstage in 5 minutes, trapped by good intentions and public expectations. Damien knelt to Amara's level. Babysit with Mr. Foster while I handle something okay. You're mad at Miss Elena. I'm frustrated. She's trying to help, Amara said with the wisdom of someone who saw past adult complications. Like you help people. The simplicity cut through his anger. Damien kissed her forehead, watched Daniel Foster guide her away, then followed Elena backstage where preparation hummed with controlled chaos. In a narrow hallway with minutes before curtain, Damien kept his voice low and hard. This is the last time you make decisions about me without asking. The last time you use my name, my story, my life as part of whatever you're building. Elena's composure cracked at the edges. I know, and I'm genuinely sorry for violating our agreement. But Damien, this foundation needed to represent someone real. Someone who embodies what we're trying to do. You are that person. I'm not your mascot. You're not. You're my partner in this if you'll let yourself be. She paused as the announcement echoed from the stage. After tonight, we figure out how to do this right. How to work together instead of me working around you. Deal. Damien wanted to refuse, wanted his anger to mean something. But the foundation was real. The need was real, and walking away now served no one except his pride. Deal. The event unfolded with practiced precision. Elena spoke about responsibility and vision, about using resources to create systems that helped rather than exploited. Damien listened and felt the irony like a knife. Here was the CEO of a company stealing from workers, talking about dignity and justice while standing beneath his name in letters 3 feet tall. Then she called him to the stage. The lights were bright enough to blind. The audience was shapes and shadows waiting for inspiration. Damien held the microphone and spoke without preparation, pulled by something deeper than strategy. I'm not good at speeches. I fix pipes. I replace light bulbs. I keep buildings from falling apart. The room settled into listening silence. But being a single dad taught me what it means to hold things together when the world is working against you. You learn to choose. Gas or groceries, heat or electricity, new shoes for your kid or paying rent on time. He found Amara in the crowd, her face bright with pride. My daughter asked me once why we eat rice every day. I told her because rice means we're together. Rice means we're okay. His throat tightened. But kids shouldn't have to understand poverty. Parents shouldn't have to choose between dignity and survival. The words came faster now, pulled from nights spent doing impossible math, from mornings watching Amara pretend her inadequate lunch was enough. This foundation isn't about me. It's about every parent working themselves to exhaustion and still falling short. Every person who feels invisible because systems weren't built to see them. Damien looked directly at Elena, standing stage left, her hand pressed to her mouth, tears visible even from this distance. You're not invisible. You matter. And now you have support. The applause began before he finished, building into recognition rather than mere appreciation. Damien stepped away from the microphone with hands that trembled, feeling exposed in ways that had nothing to do with the investigation or the evidence gathering that had brought him here. Elena met him as he left the stage. She pulled him into an embrace that lasted 3 seconds too long, and when she stepped back, her careful makeup was destroyed by tears. That was perfect, she whispered, voice thick with emotion. You were perfect. Damien wanted to stay angry, wanted to maintain boundaries and professional distance, but her tears were real, her response genuine, and standing this close, he saw that his words had affected her in ways that transcended optics or fundraising. We still need to talk, he said, about boundaries, about partnership. Tomorrow, I promise. She touched his arm briefly, and even through the suit jacket, warmth transferred. And Damien, thank you for doing this despite being angry. They parted, and Damien collected Amara from Daniel Foster, drove home, listening to his daughter's excited observations about how proud she was, how everyone had clapped, how maybe now people understood what Daddy did mattered. Later, after Amara was asleep and the apartment was quiet, Damien sat with his laptop and the growing file of evidence. The foundation was real, as Elena's commitment genuine, but so was the wage theft affecting 82 workers and counting. So was the systematic exploitation happening in the same company funding tonight's charity. The cognitive dissonance pressed against his chest, making breathing difficult. How could Elena be both the person who cried at his speech about dignity and the CEO of a company stealing wages from workers who looked like him, who struggled like he struggled? The answer, Damien knew, was that she didn't know, couldn't know. Because if she knew what her company was doing to people, she wouldn't have launched a foundation dedicated to helping them. She would have fixed the problem at its source, which meant getting closer, meant building more trust, meant continuing the careful dance of evidence gathering while a relationship grew between them that felt increasingly real and increasingly impossible to sustain once the truth emerged. Beverly's message waited on his phone. Making progress on the financial trail. Found a lead on shell companies Victor might be using. Need to verify. Will update soon. Damien typed back, good, keep digging. Then he closed the laptop, checked on Amara sleeping peacefully behind her curtain, and stood in his small apartment, feeling the weight of choices that hadn't yet been made, but already cast shadows across everything he was building. The foundation had his name now. Elena had his trust, or thought she did. Amara had someone who looked at her father with respect and taught her about stars. And Damien had evidence of crimes that would destroy all of it when the moment came to choose between protecting the woman he was starting to care about and securing justice for workers who had no one else fighting for them. Small but bright, he thought, looking at Amara's refrigerator drawing. His daughter believed the light could shine anywhere if you let it. What she didn't understand yet, what Damien was learning every day, was that sometimes the light had to shine in places that would burn everything you'd built, had to illuminate truths that would cost more than you could afford to pay. But the workers deserved justice. The evidence was building, and Damien Thorne, maintenance supervisor and father and reluctant investigator, would see this through to whatever end waited on the other side of revelation. Even if that end meant losing the first thing that had felt like hope since Celeste died. Even if it meant teaching his daughter that sometimes doing right required sacrifices that felt impossible to bear. The light would shine, the truth would emerge, and Damien would live with whatever came after, because that was what heroes did, even the secret ones, even the ones who weren't sure they deserved the title his daughter had given him. Outside Detroit settled into spring night. Inside, a man stood at the intersection of justice and love, investigation and relationship, principle and possibility, knowing he couldn't walk both paths, but not yet ready to choose which one to follow and which one to abandon. The meeting in Elena's office the following week felt different than their first negotiation. They'd both learned something from the foundation event Elena about the cost of unilateral decisions, Damien, about the complexity of doing good work through imperfect means. They reworked their agreement with more specificity, added clauses about consultation timelines, decision-making, authority consequences for violations. By the time they finished, the document looked less like a personal arrangement and more like a partnership contract, which perhaps was what they both needed. One more thing, Elena said as Damien prepared to leave. I want you on the foundation board, not as a figurehead, as an actual voting member with real authority over how programs develop. Damien paused at the door. Why? Because you'll keep me honest. You'll make sure we're actually helping people instead of just making ourselves feel better about helping people. She met his eyes. I need someone who will tell me when I'm wrong, who won't let me turn this into another business venture that looks good on paper but fails the people it's supposed to serve. The offer represented exactly what Damien needed: deeper access to Elena's world, legitimate reasons to be involved in organizational decisions, opportunities to observe how she thought about money and workers and responsibility. Beverly would see it as perfect cover for gathering evidence. But accepting meant another layer of deception, another way he was using Elena's trust to build a case against her company. I'll think about it, Damien said, and left before the guilt could show on his face. May dissolved into June. Detroit's winter chill gave way to humid heat that made the city shimmer. Amara finished second grade with grades that made Damien proud, and a summer reading list that made his wallet nervous. Elena offered to buy the books asked first, as per their agreement, and Damien accepted after confirming the local library didn't have copies available. Small compromises, small acceptances. The relationship shifting in increments that felt manageable until Damien looked back and saw how far they'd traveled from that first morning when Elena had offered him cash and he'd thrown it back in her face. The foundation board meetings happened monthly. Damien attended alongside people who donated six figures annually, who ran their own companies, who spoke a language of philanthropy and impact metrics that initially felt foreign. But he learned quickly to ask questions that cut through jargon to actual outcomes, push back when proposals seemed designed more for donor appeal than recipient benefit. And Elena listened, adjusted strategies based on his feedback, deferred to his judgment on programs targeting single parents because he'd lived that reality in ways she never had. You're good at this, she said after a particularly contentious meeting in late June where Damien had convinced the board to redirect funding from a high-profile initiative to something less glamorous, but more effective. I just asked if the thing would have actually helped me when I needed it. That's the skill. Most people on boards like this have forgotten what it feels like to need help, or never knew in the first place. Elena gathered her papers, and they walked toward the elevator together. You're making this foundation better than I could have made it alone. The praise sat uncomfortably on Damien's shoulders, weighted by the knowledge that he was there under false pretenses, that every conversation with Elena served dual purposes she couldn't see. But the foundation was doing good work. That part was real. Families were getting assistance. Programs were launching that addressed actual needs rather than perceived ones. Whatever Damien's motivations, the outcomes mattered. He held on to that truth during Tuesday meetings with Beverly when she'd show him the latest evidence and remind him what they were building toward. The case grew stronger weekly. 82 workers became 91 as more people found courage to share their stories. The pattern of wage theft sharpened into something that would be impossible to dismiss as mere error once it went public. We're close, Beverly said in early July, spreading financial documents across their library table. I've traced money flowing through 3 shell companies Victor Ashford controls. Millions of dollars that should have gone to payroll ending up in accounts linked to his wife's family trust. That's embezzlement on top of wage theft. Exactly, which means criminal charges, not just civil penalties. Beverly looked up. I've got a source who used to work in Cross's accounting department. He's willing to talk to the Department of Labor if we can guarantee protection. Once he testifies about what he was told to do about the systematic nature of the wage suppression, we'll have everything we need. Damien felt his stomach drop. How long before you approach DOL? I want to wait until fall, give my source time to prepare, make sure all documentation is ironclad. Beverly studied him. That gives you about 2 months to finish gathering whatever you're gathering and to figure out what you're going to do about her. The unspoken question hung between them: was Damien going to warn Elena before the investigation went public or let her get blindsided. I don't know, Damien admitted. You care about her. Not a question. It's complicated. It always is, Beverly said, and there was sympathy in her voice beneath the determination. Just remember 91 workers, Damien. People who can't afford lawyers or the risk of retaliation. People counting on us to see this through. Damien didn't answer because any answer would be a confession he wasn't ready to make. Summer deepened. Amara went to day camp 3 days a week, giving Damien time to work longer shifts and meet with Beverly more frequently. The other 4 days, Elena visited not just Thursdays anymore, but Saturdays too, sometimes Sundays. She and Amara had developed routines: chess on the porch when evenings cooled, astronomy apps before bed, Sunday morning pancakes that Elena insisted on making, despite Damien's protests that she didn't need to cook. I like it, Elena said one Sunday in late July, flipping pancakes with the efficiency of someone who'd learned kitchen skills out of necessity. When I was in foster care, pancakes were the thing I could make that felt special. Like I was taking care of myself, not just surviving. Amara watched from her perch on the counter, gap-toothed, smile bright. These are the best pancakes ever, Miss Elena. Better than Daddy's. Way better. Don't tell him I said that. Damien, standing 3 feet away, made a show of mock offense. I'm right here, baby. I know, Amara giggled. That's what makes it funny. Elena caught Damien's eye over Amara's head, and something passed between them. Warmth, recognition, the beginning of something that felt dangerously like family. For a moment, Damien let himself imagine this was real, that Sunday pancakes could continue without the investigation hanging over everything, that the woman making his daughter laugh could stay part of their lives. Then his phone buzzed with a message from Beverly: need to talk. Found something important, and reality reasserted itself with the force of cold water. The late August evening arrived, humid, and still the kind of weather that made Detroit feel like it was holding its breath. Amara was at a sleepover, the first time Damien had let her stay overnight at a friend's house since Celeste died. The apartment felt too quiet, too empty, too full of possibilities he'd been avoiding for months. Elena arrived at 7 with Thai food and wine, wearing jeans and a t-shirt that made her look younger, more approachable, less like the CEO who commanded boardrooms, and more like the woman who'd admitted to being terrified of letting people close. They ate on his couch, talking about everything and nothing foundation business. Amara's upcoming 3rd grade year, whether Damien would ever fix the leaky faucet in his bathroom or just keep putting a bucket under it. The conversation had the comfortable rhythm of people who'd learned each other's patterns, who could sit in the silence without it feeling awkward. Can I ask you something? Elena set down her wine glass and turned to face him fully. Sure. Why haven't you ever asked me about my past, about foster care, about how I built the company, about any of the details that usually make people curious? Damien considered his answer carefully. Because I figured you'd tell me when you were ready, and because people aren't their histories. You're not just a foster kid who made good any more than I'm just a widower raising his daughter alone. But those things shape us. They do, but they don't define us. He met her eyes. You want to tell me about it? Elena was quiet for a long moment, fingers tracing the rim of her glass. Then she started talking about aging out of the system at 18 with $200 and nowhere to go, about sleeping in her car while working 2 jobs and taking night classes, about the loan officer who'd believed in her business plan when no one else would, about building cross enterprises from nothing, because she'd learned early that safety came from resources and resources came from risk. My father, not biological, the man who eventually adopted me when I was 23, he taught me that money was power, that having resources meant never being vulnerable again. She paused. But you taught me something different, that money can't buy the things that actually matter, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse payment. Damien's chest tightened. Elena, I'm falling for you, she said quietly. Have been for a while now, and that terrifies me because every time I've cared about someone, they've either left or they've wanted something from me. But you're different. You keep refusing things I try to give you. You call me on my mistakes. You make me want to be better than I thought I needed to be. The confession hung between them, honest and vulnerable and impossible. Because Damien was falling for her too, had been falling, despite his intentions, despite the investigation, despite knowing that everything he was building with her was constructed on a foundation of deception that would eventually crumble. I care about you too, he said, and it was the truest thing he'd said to her since this started. More than I should. More than is probably wise. Why isn't it wise? Because I'm investigating your company. Because I'm gathering evidence that will destroy your reputation. Because everything between us is built on lies you don't know I'm telling. But he couldn't say any of that, so instead Damien reached for her hand, laced their fingers together, and told a different truth. Because I have a daughter who's watching how I do this, who's learning about love from the choices I make. I need to do this right, need to build something that's real and solid and worth the risk of letting someone in. Elena's hand tightened on his. I can do real. I can do solid. I've never been good at slow, but I'll learn if that's what you need. It's what Amara needs. She's already asking if you can be her mom. And I need to be sure, need to know this is something that's going to last before I let her hope for that. It will last. Elena moved closer, close enough that Damien could smell her perfume, could count the gold flecks in her gray eyes. I don't do anything halfway, Damien. When I commit to something, I commit completely. That's how I've survived everything I've survived. And I'm committing to this. To you. To Amara. To building something that matters more than money or status or any of the things I used to think were important. Damien's hand came up to cup her face, thumb brushing across her cheekbone. She leaned into the touch, eyes fluttering closed, and for a moment everything else fell away. The investigation, the evidence, the impossible choice waiting in his future. He kissed her. Gentle at first, testing, asking permission with touch instead of words. Elena responded with intensity that surprised him, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer, kissing him like she'd been waiting months for this permission. When they finally broke apart, breathing hard, Elena smiled against his mouth. That wasn't very slow. No, Damien agreed, even as his hands stayed locked in her hair. It wasn't. They spent the hours until midnight on his couch, trading kisses and conversation, learning the topography of each other's boundaries. Elena told him about the loneliness of being CEO, about how everyone wanted something from her and no one just wanted her. Damien told her about Celeste's final days, about the promise he'd made to take care of Amara, about the guilt of being relieved when the suffering finally ended. They traded vulnerability like currency, and somewhere in that exchange, the lines between investigation and relationship blurred beyond recognition. This wasn't just strategy anymore. Damien was in love with her, had been falling for weeks without admitting it even to himself, and that love made what was coming infinitely worse. When Elena left near 1 a.m., kissing him goodbye at the door with a tenderness that felt like promise, Damien closed the door and leaned against it, feeling the weight of what he'd just done pressing against his chest like a physical mass. His phone showed 3 missed calls from Beverly. A text, urgent, call me ASAP. Damien dialed and she answered before the first ring finished. I found it. Her voice shook with controlled adrenaline. The smoking gun, email archives from 2018. Victor Ashford and Elena's father designed the entire system. Shell companies, offshore routing, systematic wage suppression, all of it documented in writing. The world tilted. Damien gripped the doorframe, processing what Beverly had just said. Elena's father. The man she still mourned, still spoke of with reverence, still measured herself against. How did you get emails from 2018? Former administrator, crossfired him last year and he kept backup files. Didn't realize what he had until I asked specific questions. Beverly's breathing came fast. Damien, this is everything we need. Proof of intent, proof of conspiracy, proof that this was company policy, not isolated errors. Does Elena's name appear anywhere in the emails? No, the system was already operational when she became CEO in 2020. But legally, she's responsible for what happens under her watch. She'll face consequences, even if she didn't know. Damien closed his eyes, seeing the devastation that was coming. Elena learning her father was a thief, her company facing federal investigation, her reputation destroyed by association with crimes she hadn't committed but couldn't escape. And him, the person who'd kissed her an hour ago, while knowing he was building the case that would tear her world apart. When are you approaching DOA? Soon, 2 weeks, maybe 3. I want to verify the email metadata, make sure everything is admissible. Beverly's voice softened. Damien, you need to tell her. Before this breaks, she deserves to know it's coming. If I tell her, she might use her resources to bury the investigation. And if you don't, she'll know you were lying to her the entire time. That everything between you was strategy. Beverly paused. Which is worse? Damien didn't have an answer. The line went dead, and he stood in his apartment, surrounded by evidence of the evening wine glasses on the coffee table, the impression of Elena's body on his couch, the taste of hers still on his lips. And underneath it all, the knowledge that in 2 weeks or 3, everything would detonate. Before Damien could process Beverly's revelation, before he could decide whether to warn Elena or stay silent, a different crisis arrived. Jasmine Hart appeared at his door on a Tuesday evening in early September, 5 years after she'd left him in Amara, and disappeared into addiction. She looked healthier than he remembered, dressed carefully, carrying herself with the uncertain confidence of someone who'd fought their way back from the edge. I want to see my daughter. The custody battle that followed compressed into 2 brutal weeks. Jasmine's lawyer painting Damien's poverty as neglect, his long work hours as absence, his single-parent household as inadequate for a growing girl who needed maternal influence. Damien represented himself, refused Elena's offer of legal help because accepting would create debt he couldn't afford and complications he couldn't explain. He went into court armed with 8 years of documentation, report cards, and doctor's visits and teacher conferences and the 1,000 small proofs that he'd shown up every day that love was more than in biology. The hearing fell on a Thursday. Elena texted that morning, thinking of you. You've got this. Call me after Damien didn't respond. Couldn't find words that wouldn't be lies or promises he couldn't keep. The courtroom was small and bureaucratic. The judge was efficient, experienced, unmoved by emotion without evidence to back it. When Amara was called to testify, Damien watched his 8-year-old walk to the witness stand with courage that made his throat close. Amara, the judge said, voice gentling, do you understand why you're here? Yes, ma'am. You want to know who I should live with. Do you love your mother? Amara looked at Jasmine with the solemn consideration of someone taking the question seriously. I think so. I don't remember her very much, but Daddy says she loved me before she got sick. And do you want to live with her, to get to know her better? Silence stretched while Amara processed. Then with a voice that didn't waver, I want my mommy to be healthy and happy, but I want to live with my daddy because he was there every morning when I woke up, every night when I was scared, even when it was hard, even when we didn't have very much. She paused, then added, Mommy left when things got hard. Daddy stayed, and people can change, but I need to live with someone who won't leave when things get hard again. The ruling came 2 days later. Full custody to Damien, supervised visitation for Jasmine pending continued sobriety. Damien should have felt relief. Instead, he felt hollow. The person he wanted to celebrate with was the same person whose world he was about to help destroy. On Sunday morning, Beverly called. It's happening. DOL confirmed they're opening a formal investigation. They'll contact Cross Enterprises Monday morning. That fast? They've been reviewing the evidence for a week. The emails are damning enough that they can't ignore it. Beverly paused. Damien, this is going to be big. Federal case, probably criminal charges for Victor. And Elena? I know. Damien's hand tightened on the phone. How did the press find out? Someone at DOL leaked it. It's already running on Channel 7. Damien's stomach dropped. He turned on the television and there it was, Cross Enterprises under investigation for systematic wage theft. The coverage detailed everything: 73 workers initially identified, now 91. 6 years of underpayment, millions in stolen wages, shell companies and offshore accounts. And Elena's name repeated over and over, attached to crimes she hadn't committed but couldn't escape. His phone exploded with messages. Co-workers, Daniel Foster, people he hadn't heard from in years. And one that made his blood run cold. We need to talk. Now, my office. Elena. Damien arrived to find her behind her desk, surrounded by documents. He recognized the same evidence he'd helped Beverly compile. She looked up when he entered, and the betrayal in her eyes was so acute it felt like being gutted. Did you know? The question hung in the air. Damien understood this was the moment everything hinged on the choice between truth and continued deception. Yes. Elena flinched like he'd struck her. For how long? Since before we met. I investigated your company 6 years ago, found evidence of wage irregularities. Got fired before I could finish. The words came flat, stripped of emotion, because emotion would make this unbearable. I've been gathering evidence for months, with Beverly Wright. Beverly, Elena's voice was barely above a whisper. The HR assistant we fired for, she was documenting, and you helped her. 91 workers, Elena. Millions of dollars over 6 years. Systematic wage theft targeting minority workers. Damien pulled out his phone, showed her the emails Beverly had found. And your father? Don't. The word came sharp, desperate. Don't tell me my father was involved. Don't make me. But Damien couldn't stop. He showed her the emails with her father's signature, the shell company, authorizations, the systematic design of wage suppression. Watched her read with trembling hands, watched her world fracture as everything she believed about her legacy cracked and reformed into something ugly. When she looked up, tears tracked down her face unchecked. You knew all this time. While I was falling for you, you knew and you said nothing. I needed to know if you were complicit or ignorant. So you used me, built a relationship to gather evidence. Let me fall for you. Let me get close to your daughter while you were systematically destroying everything I've built. Her voice rose, losing its controlled executive polish. You kissed me 2 weeks ago, made me believe you cared, made me believe someone could actually want me without needing something from me. And it was all strategy. That's not, Damien stepped forward, hands raised. Elena, I do care about you. That part was real. Was it? Her laugh was bitter. Or was caring just another useful emotion, another way to get access? I needed to know the truth, needed to protect those workers. Then why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you come to me with what you found and let me fix it? Elena stood, bracing her hands on the desk. I would have listened. I would have investigated. I would have made this right. Would you, or would you have used your lawyers to bury it, used your money to make it go away, used everything at your disposal to protect your company and your father's reputation? The accusation hung between them, and Elena flinched again. You don't know that. You didn't give me the chance to prove otherwise. Because I couldn't risk it. Because 91 workers were counting on this evidence to get justice. And what about me? Elena's composure shattered completely. Did I count for anything? Or was I just the CEO you needed to get close to? Damien didn't have an answer that wouldn't sound like excuse or justification. In the silence, Elena's face hardened into something cold and final. Get out. Elena, out of my office, out of my building. You're fired effective immediately. You're firing me for exposing wage theft. I'm firing you for lying, for using me, for making me believe, her voice cracked, for making me believe someone could care about me without wanting something I could provide. The words hit like physical blows. Damien tried once more. I do care. That's why I waited. That's why I gave you time to. You gave me time to what? To fall for you more deeply, to get more attached to Amara, to build a future in my head that you knew would never exist. Elena's eyes were red, her makeup destroyed. Get out now before I say things I'll regret. Damien left, walked out of Cross Enterprises for the last time, his security badge confiscated by Marcus Wade with professional sympathy, his belongings packed into a box that felt too small to contain 6 years of his life. Outside, September morning was crisp and clear. Inside that building, Elena Cross was learning that the man her father had been wasn't the man she'd believed in, that the company she'd built her identity around was constructed on exploitation, that the person she'd trusted most had been gathering evidence to destroy it all. Damien sat in his truck for 30 minutes before he could drive. When he finally started the engine, his phone showed a message from Beverly. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to leak this way. Are you okay? He typed back. Define okay, then drove home to tell Amara that Miss Elena wouldn't be coming around anymore, that sometimes doing the right thing meant losing people you cared about, that love wasn't always enough to survive the choices people made. Amara took it better than expected, with the resilience of someone who'd already learned that people left. But that night, Damien heard her crying through the curtain, and the sound broke something in him that hadn't broken when Elena fired him or when she'd said she didn't want him. Because his daughter had lost someone too, had lost the woman who taught her about stars and made her father smile. And that loss felt unforgivable in ways Damien's own heartbreak didn't. The following week blurred into a series of developments Damien followed from a distance. Victor Ashford was fired, faced criminal charges. Elena resigned as CEO but remained on the board. The company implemented reforms under federal consent decree. Workers were contacted about restitution. Justice was happening. The system was being fixed. And Damien felt no satisfaction in any of it. A month after the investigation went public, an envelope arrived. Inside, the deed to Unit 4B transferred to his name. Also a letter on plain paper, Mr. Thorne. You were right about the wage theft. Right to investigate. Right to expose it. You were wrong to lie to me. Wrong to use my feelings as cover. Wrong to let me fall for you while knowing you'd destroy everything. I don't forgive you. I don't think I ever will. But I understand why you did it. And I hope that understanding helps you sleep better than I'm sleeping. The workers are getting their money back. You won. That should matter more than what we lost. It doesn't, but it should. Damien read it 3 times, then put it with Celeste's things with the evidence of who he'd been and who he'd become. That evening, Amara asked if they could call Miss Elena. I don't think that's a good idea, baby. Why not? You said people can fix mistakes. Some mistakes are too big to fix. Amara was quiet then. Was it because of the secret hero thing, helping other people? Damien pulled her into his lap. Yeah, I was trying to help people who were being hurt, but helping them meant hurting someone else, someone we both cared about. Did you have to choose? The question was too sophisticated for 8 years old. Damien gave her truth. I thought I did. I thought I could do both, help the workers and keep Elena. But I was wrong. Our light shines small, but it shines bright, Amara said softly. Right, Daddy? Right, baby. Then maybe the light had to shine where it hurt, even if it hurt us too. Damien held his daughter tighter, feeling the weight of her wisdom, the burden of having taught her that doing right sometimes meant accepting unbearable loss. Outside, Detroit continued indifferent to the choices made in a small apartment where a man sat with his daughter owning a home bought by the woman whose life he'd helped dismantle, whose trust he'd exploited, whose love he'd lost in service of a truth that needed telling. Small, but bright. The light had shone. The truth had emerged. Workers were getting justice. And Damien Thorne sat in the wreckage of what might have been, wondering if the cost had been worth the principle, if 91 workers' restitution balanced against his daughter's tears and Elena's devastation. He didn't have an answer, wasn't sure he ever would, but the light had shone, and sometimes that had to be enough.